Hello and welcome back. So here we are continuing our series on investigating these dietary questions within the Adventist community. Today's topic is the much anticipated vinegar. Vinegar and Ellen G. White, a historical and scientific investigation. Okay, for the non-Adventists that are here, I thought it would be best to introduce Mrs. White. So Ellen G. White, who lived between 1827 and 1915, is the most translated female nonfiction author in the history of literature. She is one of the founding figures of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and she played a pivotal role in the establishment of what is now Loma Linda University Medical Center. She taught that the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. This was really one of the main, pillars of her teachings and writings, and her writings emphasized wholeness, linking physical health, mental clarity, and spiritual vitality as inseparable. Of course, she wrote on numerous other topics, but about 10% of her writings did focus on health and wellness. Okay, a little bit about me for those of you who don't know me. My name is Dr. Kazzi. I'm a registered dietitian with a BS and a master's in nutrition and dietetics. I have a PhD in rehabilitation science. I graduated from Loma Linda University. I'm a published researcher, a cookbook author. I am in clinical and private practice. I'm the mother to Joseph and Amaya. I'm wife to Lucas, and I'm a practicing Adventist. In addition, I started this series on YouTube. Okay, a major disclaimer. The information being provided here is for you to utilize your own judgment on the matter. I am not telling anyone what to do or what to believe. The purpose of this presentation is to lay out the known data on this topic, which up until now has not been thoroughly addressed by a nutritional expert in the Adventist community. The objective, we're going to examine Mrs. White's counsel on vinegar usage within its historical and health context. We're going to compare it with modern vinegar production and scientific findings. And my hope is to provide a balanced, principle-based understanding on this topic that equips Adventists today to make informed, health-conscious decisions in harmony with inspired health reform. Okay, so why investigate vinegar? So it just so happened it was the #1 question received after I started the series. Mrs. White made strong statements against vinegar. But on the other hand, vinegar is now praised in the health circles and in evidence-based research. So has something changed? This is what we're going to investigate. I thought it would be best to approach this through 4 lenses. We're going to examine this whole topic of vinegar through Mrs. White's writings. We'll look at some of her quotes. We're going to look at the historical background of vinegar, and then we're going to look at modern nutrition science. And then finally, I'm going to present some rational, principle-based analyses for us to take everything together and make a conclusion. Okay, lens #1, Mrs. White's quotes. Here we go. Pickles and all kinds of vinegar should be discarded from the diet. They are wholly unfit for the stomach and they inflame the blood. Many, instead of taking pure water, quench their thirst. Okay, so that's already a bad health practice there. They're quenching their thirst with tea, coffee, or vinegar pickles, which inflame the stomach and cause disease. Next quote, I have seen poor, feeble women. Okay, we're already looking at or observing a more sick population carry to their mouths pickles, vinegar, mustard, pepper, and spices with their feeble stomachs craving something to stimulate and then suffer the consequences. So she's observing an already at-risk population and they're consuming high acidic foods. They're already having vulnerable and compromised digestive systems. Keep this in mind. The core concerns of Mrs. White over here, stomach irritation. Vinegar was viewed as irritating to the stomach lining. The second thing, blood inflammation. She often used language like inflames the blood, a 19th century expression often tied to systemic inflammation or disrupted humoral balance. Finally, stimulating effect. Mrs. White categorized vinegar alongside with other stimulating substances like mustard and pepper, which she associated with cravings and poor appetite regulation. So to put this in context, Mrs. White is observing an already at-risk population, and this population that's ill for the most part has digestive disorders. In addition to that, they are also seeking poor health habits because they're going for what's stimulating and what tastes good and what fuels the appetite rather than following healthier principles. Another quote, the salads are prepared with oil and vinegar. And by the way, the oil at Mrs. White's time might not always have been extra virgin olive oil. Extra virgin olive oil wasn't as commonly available. It was pretty expensive. And what was more readily available and cheaper was cottonseed and corn oil, which probably contributed to a less healthier vinaigrette. So she linked vinegar to poor digestion, fermentation in the stomach, toxic accumulation, and liver and kidney stress. The concern here was for health decline, not the condiments alone. Vinegar wasn't condemned in a vacuum. It was often consumed with low fiber, heavy foods, which is consistent. We see that in Mrs. White's comments. Highly seasoned food, very salty, lots of spices, and poor digestive function was observed during this time. So her audience were often sick, inflamed, or overstimulated. So she was addressing what vinegar was doing in that context, not in isolation. Okay, how is vinegar made? Vinegar is the product of acetic acid fermentation. You have two stages. Stage one, yeast, naturally occurring yeast on fruits such as apples or grapes. Convert the sugars into ethanol. So the sugars that exist are converted into ethanol. This is called alcoholic fermentation. That's stage number one. Stage two is acetobacter bacteria is introduced to this alcoholic solution, and then it's oxidizing the ethanol into acetic acid. This is known as acetic fermentation. So you end up with an alcohol. Once it's exposed to oxygen along with this bacterial exposure, it's going to create the vinegar. Okay, so don't let this slide overwhelm you. I want to put some of my biochemistry to use. So the biochemical process of vinegar. Step one is that alcoholic fermentation we just talked about. So we have the glucose C6H12O6 converted into ethanol and carbon dioxide. Now, step two, the acetic acid fermentation, we have the ethanol, which is the C2H5OH, exposed to oxygen along with the acetobacter bacteria, produces two things, acetic acid and water. That is what vinegar is made out of. It's made out of 4 to 5% acetic acid in a solution of water. There might be trace elements also produced, but they're negligible, therefore they're not mentioned in these chemical reactions. Now let's look at the history of vinegar production in the 1850s and 1900s. Please note that Mrs. White's health reform message was given after 1863, and most of her comments on vinegar were given in the late 1880s. So the cider vinegar was made from apples, the wine vinegar was made from grapes, and malt vinegar was made from grains. Now the production methods, we had the Orleans method. This was the predominant method used during this time frame. So the solution was stored in wooden barrels. It could take anywhere from 3 to 6 months to produce the vinegar. It was prone to contamination, mold, acetic acid spikes. There was no filtration, pasteurization, or quality control during this time. We actually didn't begin to see regulation until the mid-1900s. So the final product was usually cloudy, microbially active, and often contaminated, and there was also varied acidity. So there was risk of spoilage and undesirable fermentation as evidenced by the mold, yeast, and other bacterias. So let's look at this again. What are the main concerns? Sanitation was inconsistent during this time. Spoiled batches were quite common. A lot of the times, the vinegar was overly acidic, and impure vinegar could irritate the digestive tract. It was often combined with excess salt, sugar, mustard, or spices in pickles and in condiments, or it was not diluted properly. So let's keep these concerns in mind as we go along. Okay, modern vinegar. Now we're in the 1900s, and what came along in the 1950s was submerged fermentation. In 2 to 3 days, you could produce vinegar, whereas before, you need weeks to months to produce your vinegar. This was a revolutionary method, and it gained significant traction in the 1950s. So it involved filtered, pasteurized, and regulated vinegar, and the types of vinegar produced were the distilled white vinegar. This was definitely a harsher vinegar. It was used mostly for cleaning and in some case pickling. Then we have a raw apple cider vinegar with the mother. The mother is basically a SCOBY, which is like a cellulose development of bacteria. It's harmless, and this is what you use to make more vinegar. And then you have balsamic, rice, wine, and coconut vinegars that came along. This submerged fermentation method is happening in a much shorter amount of time, more predictable acidity, less irritation, and diverse culinary uses resulted. So vinegar production methods over time, I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of a snapshot of what it looked like. The Orleans method was very slow, and it was small batches, and it was vulnerable to spoilage. And then for the modern industrial era with the submerged fermentation, it's fast, it's high yielding, it's steady, continuous production, and it's neutral and cleaner, and it's filtered and distilled, and now more available for commercial use. Whereas before, during the Orleans method usage time, people were probably producing vinegar domestically, which could definitely increase the risk of spoilage and safety issues. I knew this was going to be a question, so I definitely included it. Alcohol content in vinegar, then versus now. So historical vinegars made via natural fermentation, incomplete fermentation often left traces of alcohol, very small amounts. If you had no filtration and no pasteurization, you may have up to 0.2 to 1% ethanol residual possible. That's still a very small amount. Now, modern vinegars, on the other hand, are controlled fermentation. Nearly all the ethanol is oxidized into acetic acid. It's like completely negligible to even consider it. The legal standard is most contain less than 0.1%. So we're talking 10 times less than what was in the historical vinegars. So let me give you an idea of how little this alcohol actually is. Ethanol in vinegar is extremely low. So 1 tablespoon of vinegar, which is, by the way, you're going to hear this throughout the presentation, 1 tablespoon, 1 tablespoon, 1 tablespoon. That's an appropriate dosage. More than that is probably going to be damaging. Less than that probably won't be as effective. And we'll talk more about this later. 1 tablespoon of vinegar, about 15 milliliters, with 0.1% ethanol equals to about 0.015 grams of alcohol. For comparison, you're going to love this. A ripe banana contains 0.2 to 0.4 grams of ethanol. So technically, a ripe banana has more alcohol than 1 tablespoon of vinegar. And in addition to that, we have metabolism that kicks in and just eradicates any remnants. The body easily metabolizes trace amounts via alcohol dehydrogenase, which is an enzyme found in the liver. There is no intoxicating effect at levels found in vinegar. It's just too negligible. And to put it in further perspective, you would need liters of vinegar to match a single sip of wine. So is vinegar intoxicating? No, it's not. Vinegar does not contain enough ethanol to intoxicate, especially modern vinegar. Trace levels are metabolically insignificant, and we have them commonly in many natural foods such as fruit, bread, kombucha. And so for those who are really concerned though about that tiny insignificant trace amount, you could choose distilled or fully pasteurized vinegars, even though the apple cider vinegars that are raw are definitely microbially healthier for you. If this bothers you though, sure, just go for the distilled versions. But the idea here is you want to recognize context and dose definitely matter. Regulation of vinegar. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed prohibiting adulterated or misbranded vinegar. The 1940s and 1950s, the FDA begins enforcing minimum 4% acetic acid for vinegar labeling. And today, under the 21 CFR 184-1005, vinegar is regulated for acidity, purity, residual alcohol levels. It ensures safe, standardized vinegar across all food applications. And again, to put in perspective, it wasn't until 1906 that this act came out. It wasn't until the 1940s that this label enforcing system began. And remember that Mrs. White's comments on vinegar were specifically stated in the late 1880s. Now let's take a look through the nutritional science lens. Metabolic health, culinary enhancements, and practical nutrition. These are the three sections we're going to look at, starting with metabolic health. Metabolic health. What are the evidence-based benefits of incorporating vinegar in our diet? Number one is blood sugar regulation. Acetic acid has been shown to slow down gastric emptying and enhance insulin sensitivity. The mechanism is that it inhibits disaccharidase, which is an enzyme. It inhibits its activity in the small intestine. It delays carbohydrate absorption because the quicker your carbohydrates gets absorbed and the glucose gets in your blood, the higher your sugar spikes will get. And the more sugar spikes we have throughout our lifetime, the more dysregulation of insulin we're going to experience, and the higher risks of developing prediabetes and diabetes becomes. So this delaying component is very key. It also improves postprandial glycemia, which is basically the blood sugar levels after the meals. It improves those levels for us. Next, we have appetite control and satiety. Vinegar intake before meals may increase the feelings of fullness, reducing caloric intake. And particularly, it's been found useful for those with insulin resistance, PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome, or metabolic syndrome. Antimicrobial and antifungal properties, very well established in the literature. Acetic acid, again, what is vinegar? Vinegar is 4% acetic acid in a solution of water. It's water and acetic acid. Acetic acid has natural antimicrobial activity and it's helpful for preserving foods without synthetic additives, which is very important in the food industry and those trying to naturally preserve their foods. It's important for supporting oral and digestive health. In regulating pH levels, yes, vinegar can actually be used as an antidote for someone whose pH levels are way too basic or way too high. It can help to bring down the pH levels to normal, and it promotes growth of beneficial bacteria in the gut microbiome. So you might already know this, but your gut microbiome has good and bad bacteria. The changes in the ratio where you have too much bad bacteria to good bacteria is when you might develop dysbiosis or this lack of balance in bacterial makeup. So what acetic acid can do is that it can actually help stabilize and balance the microbial activity in the gut. So tons of benefits there. Now you might be wondering, when might vinegar be problematic? You have conditions where it can be. You have GERD, which is gastroesophageal reflux disease. You have ulcers, gastritis, histamine sensitivity, especially with the wine vinegars. Animal erosion. Animal is the protective layer on your teeth. It can definitely be eroded with excessive acetic acid intake, especially if it's not properly diluted. And I do believe that a lot of these conditions, especially the ulcers, gastritis, and GERD, might have been what Mrs. White was seeing in her time based on how she describes this inflammatory gastric reaction that people are experiencing. They didn't have these terms yet, but the way she describes it seems consistent. So yes, vinegar isn't for everyone. Some people do experience irritation or reflux, and like any food, we need to be mindful of our unique bodies and the symptoms that we experience. A lot of people know what's good for them and what's not. They've lived with themselves their whole lives. And so remembering that the dosage and the individual response, those two things are key and they matter when assessing whether a food product will be good or bad for us. Okay, now we're going to look at the culinary enhancements that vinegar provides. First of all, it boosts flavor and complexity. So I've been a registered dietitian for years. I'm a cookbook author. Created probably hundreds of recipes. And what I have noticed when it comes to behavioral change, flavor matters. It matters for long-term sustainable adherence. So what does it do? It brightens dishes. It balances sweetness. It softens bitterness. Vinegar and plant-based fats, such as olive oil, tahini, or nuts, result in a creamy, satisfying dressing that can really elevate any plant-based meal. A small amount mimics this umami depth, often lacking in plant-based ingredients. Also, it increases the meal satisfaction, which is again very important. Tangy flavor may help reduce cravings for processed or overly salty foods, and it encourages a return to fresh vegetables and legumes. Finally, it supports the dietary adherence, the behavioral change, the sustainability component. Taste plays a huge role in staying committed to healthy eating. So here are the best vinegars today. Let's remember that even though there are different types of vinegars, they're essentially quite similar since it's mainly acetic acid and water. We are basically differing in certain bacterial components and possibly flavors, but essentially they're very close in nature. So raw apple cider vinegar will have the most benefits for gut health and blood sugar support. And the important thing is just try to find the mother. The mother is the cellulose remnants at the bottom of the jar. Don't be scared of that. That stuff is good and it just provides a more authentic version of your vinegar. And if you filter those out, you lose some of those benefits. Not to say you can't have the filtered version, but just keep that in mind. For the red and white wine vinegar, there's definitely more mild in flavor. It's still gut friendly, and it's best used for vinaigrettes as the apple cider vinegar tends to be a little strong and overpowering. The distilled white vinegar, this is clean, this is affordable, but it's best for cleaning and possibly for pickling. It's a harsher vinegar, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend that to have a tablespoon of that with your water if you're trying to control your blood sugar levels. I would definitely recommend the raw apple cider vinegar as being more appropriate for that. Then you have balsamic. Balsamic vinegar is basically made from grape juice. It started with grape juice and that grape juice is reduced. And after it's reduced, it's then fermented. And after it's fermented, it's converted into acetic acid. So it's very rich and flavorful. Just make sure to check for added sugars because they tend to add that. The rice vinegar is more seen in Asian cuisine, and coconut vinegar, it's less common, but it is mineral rich. Okay, practical nutrition. Let's get into this part. A balanced approach. And I think fundamentally speaking, if you can approach vinegar in the context of balance, that makes a huge difference in the implications and the nutritional value that you can experience. So for the health-seeking individual, vinegar can be a metabolic tool for blood sugar and cravings. It can be a culinary enhancer for vegetables, legumes, and grains. It can be a digestive aid, especially with bitter or fermented foods. But it must be used in context, not drowned on every meal. I don't recommend pouring vinegar on all of your food. I think the 1 tablespoon principle makes the most sense in terms of the therapeutic benefits and for the flavoring benefits. If you want to add a few tablespoons in a vinaigrette that you're making and that you're distributing between 3 or 4 people, then that's totally fine. But don't drown it. That's another thing, because I know some people can literally eat a whole jar of pickles in one sitting. That's not recommended and that's not moderate. They can cover an entire hot dog, just slather it with ketchup, and ketchup is very high in vinegar. So it must be used in context. Not drowned on every meal, not treated as a cure-all, which is another thing, and not consumed without mindfulness. So I do believe the 1 tablespoon principle can be used as a guide in order to protect ourselves from excessive usage. Lens number 4, rational principle-based analysis. We're going to view everything we just looked at through this final lens and tie it all together. First of all, I want to acknowledge respect for the messenger. Mrs. White's health writings were decades ahead of their time. She warned against overstimulation, poor digestion, and toxic dietary habits long before science could confirm what inflammation, gut dysbiosis, and metabolic dysfunction actually were. Way ahead of her time, and that should be commended. Now, it's important to note her audience, the people she was observing, they were not living on kale salads and quinoa bowls. They were struggling with improper dietary practices, hard to digest meals, highly seasoned acidic foods, very heavy meals, minimal fiber. So her stance on vinegar then wasn't arbitrary. It was protective, it was restorative, and it was tailored for a specific health crisis that she was observing at that time. So let's zoom out and look at the forest. What was the goal? Her goal was to create an environment where the body could heal itself. And vinegar, in its crude 19th century form, often did more harm than good in the context of already heavy, acidic, low fiber foods. And at the same time, her writings accommodate a respect for the science. Today, we can analyze modern vinegar biochemically and understand its physiological impact. In moderate doses, certain types, especially raw apple cider vinegar, have clear benefits, particularly for the blood sugar management, satiety control, and flavor enhancement of plant-based diets. We also know that individual variability matters. What benefits one person might not benefit another, and that's okay. Here's a rational perspective that she stated: I cannot eat beans, for they are poison to me. Beans are poison to her. But this is so interesting because doctors like Michael Greger and other plant-based physicians are high proponents of legumes as being superfoods. And yet for Mrs. White, it was a poison in the sense that she reacted very poorly when she consumed it. She goes on, but for me to say that for this reason, no one must eat them would be simply ridiculous. I cannot eat a spoonful of milk gravy or milk toast without suffering in consequence. But other members of my family can eat these things and realize no such effect. Therefore, I take that which suits my stomach best, and they do the same. So she was very much aware that all bodies were different and would respond differently to certain foods. What might be harmful to one person might be beneficial for another. What might be beneficial for another might be harmful for another. And this is why I believe she said this statement: we do not mark out any precise line to be followed in the diet. I mean, you can't get more moderate and rational than that. And so I highly value that she recognized this. So let's bridge the two eras. So we have Ellen G. White's time. She received her health reform message post 1863, made most of her comments about vinegar in the late 1880s. And then we have our time in 2025. At her time, as we've historically established, vinegar was impure, unstable, and could be very irritating. It was used excessively in heavy seasoned meals without nutritional and mindful principles. There was little understanding of fermentation hygiene. And her focus at the time was on detoxing, was on temperance, was on healing, was on developing principles of moderation. These were new and unfamiliar concepts in the late 1800s. Now we have our time. Vinegar, refined, varied, and dose controlled. For the most part, in health conscious circles, it's used sparingly in lighter, fiber rich meals. There's strong science and evidence on regulation and fermentation control. And finally, it's focused on prevention and personalization. That's the essence of people who are using vinegar for health purposes. Dietary Council and historical perspective. Now, this is very important, and I hope you guys will listen carefully to this. When dietary councils are stated, they must be taken in the context of their specific application in that point in time. Why? Because dietary practices are subject to change. Mrs. White's dietary councils were stated over 150 years ago. And for the first time in food history, dietary practices and production have undergone dramatic changes and enhancements in the past 100 years. So in this case, we must allow the principle of Mrs. White's counsels on diet to rise above the specific application. Just in diet, though, and I'll get more to that in a second. So the question might be, well, then was Mrs. White wrong about vinegar? No, in her time, the vinegar was causing real harm to people, and her counsel protected thousands from unnecessary suffering. But today, with modern processing, scientific clarity, and discernment, there is room for reevaluation on this particular topic. When we use vinegar intentionally, when we use it moderately, and with the right type of food and dietary practices, vinegar can actually support many of the health principles that Mrs. White herself championed. She was focused on health and wholeness. Whatever would take you towards health and wholeness, most definitely include that in your dietary regimen. The goal is not to dismiss her warnings at all, but to understand their context so that we can benefit from the principles that she's trying to share. And then we can make the decisions that truly bless our body and glorify God. And as always, we're seeking for truth, not blinded commitment based on isolated statements. That's simply not rational and not consistent with Mrs. White's overall messages. So now the big question. Should Adventists today, who believe in Mrs. White's principles on health reform, be comfortable with having vinegar in moderation within the context of a balanced diet for its metabolic and culinary benefits? For me, the answer is pretty clear, but I'll let you answer that question for yourselves. So this is a final thought that I think is very important for Adventists to chew on, no pun intended, in this time in the history of our church. So while the dietary counsels of Mrs. White may adapt and evolve over time, due to advancements in food preparation, storage, and manufacturing, because we've experienced tremendous changes and enhancements in the past 100 years, the moral and lifestyle principles shared by Mrs. White remain timeless. And I really want to establish that, rooted in spiritual conviction rather than cultural or technological change. Only about 10% of Mrs. White's writings was on health reform, which included the dietary components. But over 90% of her writings was dedicated to spiritual conditions of the church, to psychology, to relationships, marriage, to church management and administration, to social and political issues, of the spiritual component of prophecy. We cannot ever think that it would be appropriate to discredit any of those, as those remain timeless. However, the dietary components are subject to change, and that's okay, because the ultimate goal doesn't change. The ultimate goal is health and wellness. And if we can achieve that, and if there are techniques and strategies that can support that, then I strongly believe that these would be in line with Mrs. White's counsels. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to tackle topics like this, because the more we're able to address these topics and come to rational conclusions, the less of a distraction it will be in the bigger scheme of the spiritual controversy we're dealing with. That way we can have more confidence in our faith, in our spirit, in our hearts. Let's remember not to lose sight of the forest when focusing on the trees. Truth is never afraid of investigation, and I hope that was demonstrated in this presentation. For those of you who made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. I hope that this helped to clarify this topic for you. I have created a summary download for you. It's available in the bottom bar below. If you have questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section. If I don't get to all of them, I most definitely do read them, so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. And please always exercise grace when submitting your comments on these topics. I'll put up some of the other topics that we already discussed. You guys can watch that as well. And of course, please subscribe, like, and share this content in order for it to reach more people. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.